The silence in the small apartment was a physical weight. For Ilara, it was a sound far more deafening than the constant hum of the sewing machine that had once filled this space with purpose. Now, the machine sat cold and dormant in the corner, a monument to a life that had vanished. She sat at the rickety kitchen table, the wood cool and rough beneath her forearms. A single, bare bulb overhead cast long, skeletal shadows across the room, making the familiar space feel alien and hostile. Her stomach was a tight, aching knot of hunger, a feeling she had grown disturbingly accustomed to. In front of her, spread out like a losing hand in a final, desperate card game, lay 3 $100 bills. $300. It was everything. The paper felt thin and fragile, a pathetic shield against the tidal wave of disaster threatening to engulf her and her children. A shiver, born not of the evening chill but of pure, unadulterated terror, traced a cold path down her spine. The smell of stale coffee from a morning she couldn't afford to repeat mingled with the scent of dust and despair. Her gaze drifted from the money to the other piece of paper on the table, the foreclosure notice. It lay there, stark white against the dark wood, its printed words like a death sentence. Final notice to vacate. The letters seemed to scream at her. 1 week. 7 days before the lock on the door would be changed, before she and her children, Leo and Mia, would be cast out onto the unforgiving city streets. A wave of nausea surged from the pit of her stomach, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. This wasn't just about a failed mortgage payment. It was the final, brutal postscript to her husband's long, agonizing illness. The mountain of medical bills had been a relentless predator, consuming their savings, their dreams, and finally, him. She could almost hear the phantom echo of his weak cough, the beep of the hospital machines that had been the soundtrack to their last year together. Her heart squeezed with a familiar, crushing grief. They had lost that battle. Now she felt the ghost of that loss reaching out to take the very last thing they had left, their home. From the other room, she could hear the faint, rhythmic breathing of her children. Leo, at 12, was trying so hard to be brave, his young face etched with a seriousness that didn't belong there. He had stopped asking about his new video game and started asking how much the groceries cost. And Mia, only 7, still clutched the worn teddy bear her father had given her, sometimes whispering to it in the dark, asking when Daddy was coming home from his long trip. Each innocent question was a tiny dagger to Ilara's heart. A profound, protective ache radiated through her chest. They were the only reason she hadn't shattered completely. She had given them the last of the milk and the heels of the bread for their dinner, murmuring that she'd eaten earlier, a lie that tasted like ash in her mouth. The guilt was a physical presence, a heavy cloak she couldn't shrug off. Their sweet, sleeping faces were a portrait of innocence, and the thought of that innocence being shattered on a cold shelter floor made her feel a panic so absolute it stole her breath. Ilara's eyes fell upon her hands, resting on the table. They were the hands of a seamstress, nimble and sure, with calloused fingertips and the occasional pinprick scar. These hands had once been a source of pride and creation, weaving threads into beautiful dresses, tailoring suits with precision, patching up the world one stitch at a time. Now they felt useless, clumsy and weak. The phone had stopped ringing with clients and started ringing with hostile, demanding voices from collection agencies. Each ring sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She had started letting it go to voicemail, the silence that followed somehow worse than the ringing itself. The world outside the grimy apartment window seemed to carry on in a different dimension. Cars swooshed by, their headlights painting fleeting stripes of light on her wall. People were going to dinner, to movies, to warm and safe homes. She felt invisible, trapped in a bubble of poverty and grief. The isolation was a cold, creeping fog, seeping into the cracks of her resolve, making her wonder if anyone would even notice if she and her children simply disappeared. Her $300, it was a joke. It was an insult. It was a choice. Food for another week. Maybe 2 if they ate nothing but rice and beans. Or it was a ticket, a gamble, a desperate, blind leap into the unknown. The image of Mia's small hand clutching her coat, her face blue with cold as they stood in line at a homeless shelter, flashed in her mind. No. She physically recoiled from the thought. A surge of fierce, primal energy coursed through her veins, a mother's defiance against an uncaring universe. She would not let that happen. She would burn that money. She would throw it away. She would trade it for a single impossible chance before she would let her children sleep on the street. A single hot tear finally escaped her eye, landing with a soft hiss on the foreclosure notice. It blurred the ink, a tiny rebellion against the finality of the words. Her body shook, not with fear anymore, but with a terrifying, newfound resolve. She would find a way. If you want to discover the desperate gamble Ilara is about to take, and the dark secret it will uncover, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part of this incredible story. That night, hunched over her aging laptop, Ilara threw her desperate prayer into the digital void. The fan inside the machine whirred with a high, strained pitch, the only sound accompanying the frantic clicking of the mouse. Her eyes burned with a dry, sandy exhaustion as she scrolled through endless listings for apartments and rooms, each price a slap in the face. A cold dread had settled deep in her bones, a feeling that this was utterly pointless. How could $300 possibly bridge the chasm between her reality and a safe place for her children to sleep? Every image of a clean, empty room felt like a personal taunt. She could smell the phantom scent of fresh paint, hear the echo of imagined laughter in hallways she would never walk. The glow of the screen illuminated the tear tracks on her cheeks as she scrolled past another no-go, her hope dwindling with every click, the cursor a tiny, flashing beacon in an ocean of impossibility. She felt utterly and completely alone, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had no place for her. Then she saw it. The listing was buried deep on a third-rate classified site, its title almost comical in its optimism. Unique living opportunity. Own your own land. The photo was blurry and taken from a distance, showing a patch of green with something colorful in the middle, but it was the number that made her breath catch in her throat. A sharp, painful gasp. $250. $250. Not for rent, for sale. A tremor went through her hands. It had to be a typo, a cruel joke, a scam. She read the description, her heart hammering against her ribs. The text was sparse, almost evasive. Small plot of land with vintage travel wagon, sold as is, private, quiet. A wagon, a circus wagon, a ridiculous, insane idea, and yet it was land. It was a roof. It was something that couldn't be foreclosed on, a place from which no one could legally evict them. The faint, romantic image of a cozy, bohemian life, a new start, flickered in the darkness of her mind. It was a single, tiny spark in the crushing blackness. The decision was a feverish, sleep-deprived impulse, born of sheer terror. $50 left for food, for a bus ticket, for everything. It was madness. She was trading the certainty of a few more weeks of food for a complete unknown. Yet the image of Mia shivering in a shelter line was a more potent fear than any rational doubt. This wagon, this wreck, this absurdity, it represented a stand. It was a declaration that she would not be swept away onto the streets. With a hand that shook so badly she could barely control the mouse, she clicked the "Contact Seller" button. The exchange was sterile and faceless, a series of short emails with a person who only signed off as proprietor. The money was transferred electronically, a silent, digital scream into the ether. For a moment after the confirmation screen appeared, she felt nothing. Then, a wave of nausea and terror so profound it almost made her pass out. What had she done? She had just gambled her children's entire world on a blurry photograph and a stranger's vague promise. Packing was an act of brutal triage. Their life, once spread comfortably through a two-bedroom apartment, now had to fit into 2 worn suitcases and a backpack. Ilara felt a fresh stab of grief with each item she discarded. The heavy stand mixer her husband had bought her for their anniversary. The framed photos of family vacations that now seemed like a fantasy. She ran her hand over the cold, silent metal of her sewing machine. It was too large, too heavy, an anchor to a past she had to leave behind. She felt as if she were amputating parts of herself, leaving them for strangers to pick through. Leo, trying to be a man, packed his few belongings with a stoic silence that broke her heart. Mia cried, clutching a small porcelain doll she was told she had to leave. But she'll be lonely. The little girl wept, and Ilara felt the words like a physical blow. She pasted a brittle smile on her face, murmuring empty promises of a new adventure, the lie tasting like poison on her tongue. The bus journey was a slow, grinding torture. The vehicle reeked of diesel fumes, cheap air freshener, and the faint, sour smell of human weariness. Ilara sat with Mia curled asleep on her lap, the child's small body a warm, precious weight. Leo sat rigidly by the window, his reflection a pale, silent ghost against the passing landscape. Ilara watched the familiar cityscape of her life, the skyscrapers, the parks, the corner store where they bought milk, blur and dissolve into an anonymous sprawl of suburbs. Then, even that faded, replaced by flat, empty stretches of highway and desolate farmland. A profound sense of dislocation washed over her. She was untethered, adrift, heading toward a place she had never seen, a future she couldn't begin to imagine. Each mile marker that flashed past the window felt like a nail being hammered into the coffin of her old life. Her heart ached with a deep, hollow loneliness, a feeling that she was driving her children not toward a new beginning, but into exile. Their arrival was not an event. It was a non-event. The bus station, in the forgotten town of Harmony Creek, was nothing more than a rusty sign and a splintered wooden bench at the side of a cracked road. When the bus pulled away with a sigh of its air brakes, it left behind a silence so absolute it felt threatening. The air was thick and damp, carrying the smell of wet soil and something else, something vaguely unpleasant, like stagnant water. The town itself was a few sad-looking buildings with peeling paint and dark windows. A handful of people on the street stared at them with a flat, unwelcoming curiosity that made the hairs on the back of Ilara's neck stand up. Following the crude, hand-drawn map the seller had emailed, they began to walk. The strap of the heavy suitcase dug a raw groove into her shoulder, and her muscles screamed in protest. Mia's small hand was sweaty in hers, and Leo walked with his head down, his face a mask of weary resignation. The paved road soon gave way to a potholed gravel track that vibrated unpleasantly up through the soles of her worn shoes. The sounds of their footsteps, the crunch of gravel and the scuff of their bags, were unnervingly loud in the quiet afternoon. Then, the gravel path devolved into a muddy, rutted lane. The going became treacherous, their shoes sinking into the thick, cloying mud with each step. Ilara felt a cold dread begin to seep into her veins, chilling her more than the damp air. This wasn't the path to a home. This was a path to nowhere. The sun was beginning its slow descent, and the trees that crowded the lane cast long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping fingers. The faint spark of hope that had sustained her through the journey was sputtering, threatening to be extinguished by this grim, unwelcoming reality. Her forced optimism was cracking, revealing the raw panic beneath. She could feel her children's trust in her wavering with every difficult, muddy step, and then they saw it. At the end of the lane, marked by a sagging, rust-eaten barbed wire fence, was the lot. Her stomach dropped. It wasn't a plot of land, it was a wound in the earth, a swampy, neglected patch of ground choked with shoulder-high weeds and strewn with the debris of other people's forgotten lives, a rusted oil drum, a collection of broken bottles, the skeletal remains of an old tire. The air hung heavy and still. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling of gentle breezes, only a dead, oppressive silence. This was her land. This was the foundation upon which she was supposed to build a new life. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in her throat, a sound halfway between a sob and a scream. The blurry photo had been a masterwork of deception, a carefully framed lie that had preyed on her desperation. She had led her children into a wasteland. The last of her money was gone, traded for this patch of mud and misery. Her eyes, refusing to believe, scanned the plot until they landed on the wagon. It was slumped in the far corner, looking less like a vehicle and more like a beached, decaying creature. One set of wheels had sunk deep into the mud, giving it a pathetic, wounded tilt. The promise of vibrant paint was a cruel joke. Faint ghosts of red and gold were visible beneath decades of accumulated grime and long, weeping streaks of rust. Large patches of the exterior wood had peeled away entirely, revealing a dark, spongy rot beneath. It wasn't a charming vintage relic. It was a derelict shell, a piece of garbage left to be reclaimed by the slow, inexorable decay of nature. Leo stopped dead in the muddy track, his mouth slightly agape. Mia, sensing the shift in her mother's posture, The sudden rigidity of her body tightened her grip on Ilara's hand. The hope that had been a tiny, flickering candle flame in Ilara's heart was instantly snuffed out, plunged into an icy, suffocating darkness. She moved as if in a trance, her feet leaden. Each step toward the wagon felt like a step toward a grave. The final few feet were a squelching, sucking mire that threatened to pull her shoes off. She reached the door, its surface rough and splintered beneath her trembling fingertips. The handle was gone, replaced by a loop of frayed rope. With a grunt of effort, she pulled. The door resisted, then opened with a long, agonizing screech of rusted hinges that echoed across the silent lot. The sound was a protest, a warning, and then the smell hit them. It was a physical assault, a thick, gagging wave of mildew, wet rot, stagnant water, and the sharp, ammoniac stench of animal droppings. It was the smell of profound, long-term neglect, the smell of a tomb. Mia immediately coughed, burying her face into the fabric of Ilara's coat. Leo took an involuntary step back, his face pale and sickened. Ilara stood frozen, the foul air filling her lungs, her last desperate gamble revealed as a horrifying mistake. Forcing herself to move, she took a hesitant step inside. The floorboards groaned with a sickening, liquid sound, feeling spongy and unstable under her weight. The interior was even worse than the outside had suggested. What little light filtered through the grimy, cracked windows illuminated a scene of absolute dereliction. Dust motes, thick as insects, swirled in the gloom. In the far corner, the roof had completely collapsed inward, leaving a ragged, gaping hole open to the grey sky. A dark, ugly stain spread across the floor and up the wall beneath it, marking the path of countless rainstorms. Puddles of murky water stood on the floor. It was less a shelter and more a sieve, offering no real protection from the elements. A cold, damp chill permeated the air, a deep, penetrating cold that felt like it was emanating from the very walls, a cold that promised sickness and misery. This wasn't a home. This was a trap. Her eyes scanned the rest of the cramped space, taking in the full scope of the disaster. A filthy mattress, stained with things she didn't dare to identify, was shoved into one corner, its stuffing bursting out of long tears. The remains of a small kitchenette, a tiny sink and a countertop, were coated in a thick layer of rust and cobwebs. The drawers hung open, filled with dirt and dead leaves. A dead bird lay on the floor near the caved-in roof. Everything was broken. Everything was filthy. Everything was ruined. There was no charm. There was no potential. There was only decay. This place wouldn't shelter her children. It would make them ill. It was a health hazard, a safety nightmare, a coffin on wheels. The last vestige of her fighting spirit crumbled, turning to dust. She had spent their last dollars not on a home, but on a disease-ridden, collapsing wreck in the middle of nowhere. The brittle composure she had maintained for weeks finally shattered. A wave of black, bottomless despair washed over her, so powerful it buckled her knees. This was it, the absolute bottom. She had made a catastrophic error, an unforgivable failure of judgment that had sealed their fate. Tears of rage, shame, and utter helplessness streamed down her face, hot against her cold skin. She opened her mouth to scream, to let out all the grief and terror she had bottled up inside, but the only sound that escaped was a choked, strangled sob. The energy drained from her body, leaving her feeling hollow and weak, a fragile shell of a person. She had promised her children an adventure, and she had led them to this. The weight of her failure was a physical, crushing force, pressing down on her chest, stealing her breath. She had tried to save them, and in doing so, she had damned them completely. Leo, seeing his mother crumble, moved to her side. He placed a small, hesitant hand on her arm, his touch surprisingly steady. "It's okay, Mom," he said, his voice trembling despite his effort to sound brave. "We can fix it. We can clean it up." But his wide, frightened eyes betrayed his words. He was just a boy, trying to hold his world together with a lie. From behind her, Mia began to cry, not loudly, but with a quiet, heartbreaking series of whimpers that were far more devastating than any tantrum. "I want to go home," she whispered, her small voice thick with tears. The simple words were a knife in Ilara's heart. They had no home. She had sold it, lost it, and this This was all that was left. The truth of their situation was stark and brutal. They were homeless, stranded, and utterly without hope. The last of her money was gone, and her last gamble had failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. As if on cue, as the last of the light faded from the sky, a cold, miserable rain began to fall. It started as a light patter, then grew into a steady, relentless downpour. The drops hammered a mournful rhythm on the intact portions of the wagon's roof, a drumming that sounded like mockery. Through the gaping hole in the corner, the rain poured in with a steady, hissing stream, adding to the puddles on the rotten floor. The temperature dropped, and the damp air became bitingly cold. Ilara instinctively pulled her children close, wrapping her arms around them as they stood huddled in the doorway of the derelict wagon. The rain began to soak the shoulders of her thin jacket. She felt the cold seep into her bones, but it was nothing compared to the icy despair that had claimed her soul. She had tried to escape the storm of their life, and she had led them right into its cold, unforgiving heart. After what felt like an eternity huddled in the doorway, a primal instinct for survival flickered to life within Ilara. It was not hope. It was something harder, colder. It was the refusal to die. She would not let her children succumb to sickness in this rotting box. Leaving them shivering under the small, dry patch near the door, she began to move. Her first target was the gaping hole in the roof. Using a broken piece of countertop she found, she scraped away the soggy, mulched wood and debris, her arms screaming with the effort. She found a loose piece of rusted tin outside and, with numb fingers, managed to wedge it over most of the opening. It was a pathetic, temporary fix, but it slowed the deluge to a persistent, rhythmic drip. The sound was a maddening water torture, but it was better than a waterfall. Each small action was a rebellion against the overwhelming despair that threatened to drown her. She was a mother fighting a tidal wave with a teaspoon, but she was fighting. The cold was a living entity, but her movement generated a tiny spark of warmth. The next battle was against the filth. With the rain partially staunched, she turned her attention to the floor. Creating a habitable space, even a tiny corner of one, became an obsession. She found a small, rusted bucket and used it to scoop up the stagnant puddles, flinging the foul water out the door. The smell was horrendous, a thick slurry of mold and decay. She gagged, her stomach churning, but she kept going. Her hands, the hands of a delicate seamstress, were soon raw and coated in grime. She ripped a piece of fabric from the ruined mattress, avoiding the worst of the stains, and began to scrub at the floorboards. There was no soap, only the gritty water and the sheer force of her will. It was a meaningless, monumental task. The dirt was decades deep, ingrained into the very soul of the wood. Yet, the simple, repetitive motion was a balm to her shattered nerves. It was something to do, something other than weep. She worked with a silent, focused fury, her world shrinking to the few square feet of floor in front of her. Leo, seeing her manic energy, seemed to draw a sliver of strength from it. He found another piece of cloth and began to work on a different section of the floor, his small face a mask of concentration. Mia, too scared to venture far into the wagon's dark interior, stayed near the doorway, diligently wiping down the wall with the hem of her own coat, her small brows furrowed. They worked in a strange, grim silence, a family united in a desperate, unspoken pact to reclaim this tiny piece of hell. Ilara's heart ached watching them. They shouldn't be here. They shouldn't be scrubbing a stranger's filth in a collapsing wreck. They should be in a warm house, doing homework, playing with toys. The guilt was a physical weight, but the shared activity, this small war against the grime, created a fragile, temporary bubble of normalcy. For a few moments, they were not victims. They were a team. The rhythmic sound of their scrubbing joined the drip of the rain, a strange symphony of survival in the encroaching darkness of the afternoon. The light inside the wagon was fading fast, the gloom thickening in the corners. They had managed to clear a small area of the floor, revealing the dark, stained wood beneath layers of mud. It wasn't clean, but it was less foul. It was a start. Ilara's muscles trembled with exhaustion, and a deep bone weariness had settled over her. She was about to suggest they stop, to huddle together for warmth, when Leo's scrubbing sound ceased. He was on his hands and knees, peering intently at the boards he had just wiped. "Mom," he said, his voice a low whisper. "Look!" Ilara crawled over to him, her knees protesting on the hard, damp wood. "What is it, sweetie?" she asked, her voice raspy with fatigue. He pointed a small, dirt-streaked finger. "This part," he said. "It's different." She squinted in the dim light. He was right. Amidst the dark, water-stained planks, one section, about 2 feet long, was a fraction of a shade lighter, its wood grain running in a subtly different direction. It looked newer, less weathered. At first she dismissed it. "It's probably just an old repair, Leo. Or maybe the light is playing tricks." Her mind, overloaded with disaster, had no room for trivial curiosities. But Leo was persistent. He ran his fingers along the edge of the board, his touch light and inquisitive. "No, it feels different. Too smoother." He pressed down on one end of the plank. It didn't move. Then he pressed on the other. It gave just a fraction of an inch, with a soft, almost imperceptible squish, a flicker of something, not quite hope, but a sharp, sudden curiosity, pierced through Ilara's exhaustion. She watched her son, this serious, observant boy, gay and trusted his instinct. She ran her own fingers along the seam. He was right. It felt different. One edge was perfectly flush, but the other had a tiny, almost invisible gap. It wasn't a repair. It was a lid. Her heart, which had been a slow, heavy drum of despair, gave a sudden, sharp thump against her ribs. She felt a prickle of adrenaline. "Keep scrubbing around the edges, Leo. Gently," she whispered, a new intensity in her voice. The atmosphere in the wagon had shifted. The oppressive misery was still there, but now it was overlaid with a thin, electric hum of mystery. Together, they worked around the perimeter of the strange plank. As Leo wiped away a thick layer of grime along the base of the wall, his cloth snagged on something. He pulled it back. Tucked beneath a peeling, curling strip of what might have once been decorative trim was a small, dark shape. Ilara leaned closer. Her breath held tight in her chest. It was metal. Using her fingernail, she carefully scraped away the caked-on dirt. A dull, greenish-brown gleam of old brass was revealed. It was a latch, a small, flat, tarnished brass latch, cleverly countersunk into the wood and hidden by the trim. It was designed not to be found. A shiver, entirely different from the cold, traced its way down Ilara's spine. This was deliberate. This was a secret. Her fingers trembled as she worked the latch. It was stiff, frozen by decades of disuse and corrosion. She pushed and pulled, her raw fingertips screaming in protest. Finally, with a sharp, grating click that was shockingly loud in the silence, the mechanism gave way. She looked at Leo, his eyes wide and dark in the twilight. She placed her fingers on the edge of the lighter-colored plank and lifted. It was heavy, far heavier than a simple piece of wood. It resisted, held down by its own weight and the damp air. With a deep grunt, she put her back into it, pulling upwards with all her strength. The board lifted with a low, groaning complaint, the sound of old secrets being disturbed. It wasn't just a plank, it was the lid of a built-in box. A heavy, reinforced false bottom set deep into the wagon's floor. The revealed opening was a rectangle of absolute, profound blackness. A strange smell wafted up, not the scent of mold, but something else entirely. Dry, dusty paper, the faint, sharp tang of old leather, and an underlying chemical scent like oil. Mia, who had been watching silently, let out a small whimper of fear. "It's okay, baby," Ilara murmured, her voice distracted. Her gaze locked on the dark void. The opening was about a foot deep and seemed to run for a good 5 or 6 feet, disappearing into the shadows under the remaining floorboards. It was a significant hidden space, made to hold something of value. For a moment, she hesitated, a primal fear of the unknown making her want to slam the lid shut and pretend they had never found it. What could be hidden in a place like this? Snakes? A corpse? But the desperate reality of her situation pushed the fear aside. She had nothing. Whatever was in this hole, it couldn't possibly make their situation worse. Taking a shaky breath that did little to calm her hammering heart, she knelt down and reached her hand into the cold, dark emptiness of the hidden compartment, her fingers brushing against something that felt smooth, waxy, and cool to the touch. Her hand closed around a thick, heavy bundle. It was wrapped in some kind of stiff, grease-stained fabric, oilcloth. She pulled it out. It was heavy, surprisingly so. Another one was next to it, and another. She pulled them out one by one, her movements becoming faster, more frantic. There were 6 bundles in total, all wrapped in the same dark, cheat-protective cloth. She laid them on the floor beside her, a strange collection of dark, lumpy packages. For a moment, she just stared at them, her mind racing. Leo had crawled closer, his fear forgotten, replaced by a consuming curiosity. "What is it, Mum? What's inside?" he whispered, his voice trembling with excitement. Ilara didn't answer. With shaking hands, she picked up the nearest bundle and began to unwrap the stiff, cracked oilcloth. The material resisted, sticky with age, but she tore at it, her desperation lending her strength. The final layer came away, revealing what was inside. She gasped, a sharp, choked sound. It was money, stacks and stacks of old United States currency, tightly bound with brittle paper bands. It wasn't a few hundred or a few $1,000s, it was a fortune. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, scanned the denominations on the top bills. 50s, hundreds. The faces of Grant and Franklin stared up at her, their expressions grim and judging in the dim light. She tore open another bundle and another. They were all the same, stacks upon stacks of cash. It was an impossible amount, more money than she had ever seen in her life, more than she could ever dream of earning. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she had to place a hand on the floor to steady herself. Her mind refused to process it. It felt like a hallucination, a fever dream brought on by hunger and despair. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears, a roaring sound that drowned out the dripping rain. This couldn't be real. It was a miracle, a cruel, impossible joke. Her poverty, her terror, her homelessness, it was all solved. She laughed, a wild, unhinged sound that was half sob. Leo stared at the money, his jaw slack with astonishment. Mia, drawn by the strange energy, crept closer and pointed a tiny finger. "Are we rich, Mummy?" she asked, her voice filled with childlike wonder. Ilara couldn't answer. She could only stare at the mountain of cash spread out on the filthy floor of the rotting wagon. It was deliverance. It was salvation. It was a ticket out of this nightmare. She could buy a house, a real house. She could buy food, a feast. She could replace her sewing machine. She could send her children to college. Every terror that had haunted her for the past year was suddenly, miraculously, erased. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in a long time, they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of overwhelming, incomprehensible relief. The weight that had been crushing her chest for so long suddenly lifted, and she could breathe again. But as she reached for another stack, her fingers brushed against something hard and flat at the bottom of the compartment. Her elation paused, replaced by a renewed flicker of curiosity. There was more. Carefully, she set the last of the money aside and peered back into the darkness. There, lying flat against the bottom, were 2 more items. The first was a thick, leather-bound book, its cover dark and cracked with age. It felt heavy and substantial in her hands. The second was a packet of papers, wrapped in twine, so yellowed and brittle they looked like they might crumble to dust if she handled them too roughly. A new feeling, a cold premonition, began to creep over her, chilling the warmth of her newfound hope. The money was one thing. This was something else. This was a story. This was evidence. Slowly, with a sense of growing dread, she untied the fragile twine around the packet of papers. They were newspaper clippings. She unfolded the top one, her eyes struggling to read the faded print in the rapidly failing light. The paper was delicate, almost translucent. The headline, stark and bold even after all these years, leapt out at her. "Daredevil circus heist stuns nation. Millions vanish without a trace." The date at the top read October 12th, 1978. Her blood ran cold. She quickly scanned the article. It detailed a brazen, brilliantly executed bank robbery. A traveling circus. The Magnifico Mondo Circus had been in town. During their final performance, a team of acrobats and roustabouts had used their unique skills to bypass the bank's security systems, emptying the vault. The local police were baffled. The FBI was called in, but the culprits and the money had simply disappeared, as if by magic. The circus had packed up in the night and vanished. A shiver racked her body. She looked at the rotting wagon around her at the faint, ghostly traces of red and gold paint, the Magnifico Mondo circus. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely hold the paper. This wasn't a miracle. This was a crime scene. The money, this impossible fortune spread on the floor, it was stolen. It was the unrecovered loot from a famous, unsolved bank heist from 50 years ago. A wave of nausea, far worse than anything she had felt before, rose in her throat. This discovery didn't solve her problems. It multiplied them by 1,000,000. Possessing this money was a crime. Reporting it would mean answering impossible questions. How could she, a destitute widow, explain finding a legendary stolen fortune in a derelict circus wagon she'd bought for a pittance? Who would believe her? She would be a suspect. The money would be confiscated, and she would be left with nothing but a criminal investigation and a ruined life. The hope that had soared so high just moments before came crashing down, shattering into 1,000,000 pieces. She was more trapped than ever before. With a sense of profound dread, she picked up the leather-bound ledger. It felt cold and sinister in her hands. She opened it to the first page. The inside was filled with neat, cramped handwriting. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown. It was a journal, or a logbook. The first entry was dated just a few weeks before the heist. Her eyes scanned the page, her heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm. The words were chillingly methodical. The plan is set. J, M, and R are practiced. They think we split it 4 ways. Fools. The city lawyer, F, has the papers ready for my new life. He thinks he's getting a cut. A bigger fool. Ilara felt the air leave her lungs. This was the confession of the ringmaster. He was planning to double-cross his own crew and the lawyer who was helping him. This ledger was a detailed account of the crime and the betrayals that followed. She was holding the key to a 50-year-old secret, a secret someone had killed for, a secret someone might still be willing to kill for. The darkness inside the wagon was almost total now. A thick, smothering blanket, broken only by the weak, bluish glow of her phone's screen. Ilara sat on the cold, gritty floor, the phone propped against a stack of money, casting a ghostly light on the open pages of the leather-bound ledger. The air was heavy with the smell of old paper and decaying leather, a scent that mingled with the persistent odor of damp rot. A bone-deep chill was seeping into her from the floorboards, but she was oblivious to it, her entire being consumed by the spidery, faded script. Each word she deciphered was a drop of ice water on her soul. This wasn't a story of adventure. It was a meticulous blueprint for greed and betrayal. Her fingers, stained with grime, trembled as she traced the lines, her heart a frantic, trapped bird beating against the cage of her ribs. The relief she had felt moments ago had curdled into a new kind of terror, one that was cold, sharp, and intelligent. She wasn't holding a fortune, she was holding a confession. She turned a page, the brittle paper crackling in the oppressive silence. Her eyes landed on an entry dated 2 days after the heist. The fools are gone. Jay got greedy, started making demands. He won't be making any more. A little push, a slip, near the lion cages during feeding time. A tragic accident. The authorities bought it. M and R were terrified. They took the pittance I offered and scattered like the rats they are. They believe the rest of the score was lost in the warehouse fire we set. A perfect misdirection. The real prize is here, my prize, safe beneath the very floorboards where I sleep. This wagon is no longer just a home. It is my vault, my fortress, my kingdom. A wave of nausea so profound it made her head swim washed over Ilara. The ledger suddenly felt obscene in her hands, its leather cover clammy, its pages stained not just with ink, but with blood. This money wasn't just stolen. It was paid for with a man's life. The weight of this knowledge was immense, a physical pressure on her chest that made it hard to breathe. Her trembling finger slid down the page, her eyes scanning frantically until they snagged on a new initial, F. The entries about F8 were cold and dismissive. Met with F again. The city lawyer, young, ambitious, with a predator's smile. He believes he is clever. For what amounts to pocket change, he has procured the documents for my new life. In 1 week I will cease to exist. I will become Mr. Silas Blackwood, a reclusive gentleman of leisure. F believes his 10% share is waiting in a locker at the bus station. He is a bigger fool than the others. He is a loose end. a tool to be used and then discarded. Ilara's blood ran cold. The ringmaster had double-crossed everyone, but a cheated predator doesn't just walk away. There's a lawyer, a man who knew the secret of the wagon, who was promised a share of the fortune, who had been searching. She felt a certainty deep in her gut. He was still out there, and he was still looking for his money. This wagon wasn't a fortress. It was a 50-year-old treasure map leading directly to her and her children. The following days were a descent into a waking nightmare of paranoia. The money, which had briefly promised freedom, now felt like a curse, a pile of paper radiating pure menace. Ilara kept it hidden, constantly lifting the heavy floorboard to ensure it was still there, her heart seizing at every unfamiliar sound, the creak of a tree branch, the cry of a distant bird, the skittering of a mouse in the walls. The constant, rhythmic drip of water from the leaking roof became a form of torture, each drop sounding like a stealthy footstep in the darkness. She couldn't sleep. Her nights spent listening, waiting. The ledger and the brittle newspaper clippings became a toxic secret she couldn't put down. She wrapped them in a plastic grocery bag and kept them tucked inside her coat, a cold, constant weight against her ribs, a reminder of the danger she had unearthed. She tried to smile for Leo and Mia, but the fear was a constant metallic taste in her mouth. She was too terrified to spend a single dollar, and the gnawing hunger returned, a dull, familiar ache. Almost a week had passed. They were rationing the last of the bread and a can of beans she'd had in her suitcase. The isolation of the lot, which at first had seemed merely unfortunate, now felt like a terrifying strategic vulnerability. The deep silence of the surrounding woods was no longer peaceful, it was watchful, predatory. Then, one afternoon, a sound sliced through the stillness, a sound so alien to this place of decay that it made her entire body go rigid. It was the low, confident purr of an expensive car engine, growing steadily louder as it navigated the muddy, rutted lane. Ilara's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Her first, primal thought was a silent scream. He found us. She grabbed her children, her fingers digging into their small arms, and pulled them back from the doorway into the deepest shadows of the wagon. Her mind was a whirlwind of pure panic. She shoved the plastic-wrapped ledger deeper into her coat, her body seized by a tremor she couldn't control. This was it. The hunter had found the map, a gleaming black sedan, its paintwork impossibly clean and polished, glided to a stop at the edge of the property. It looked like a panther that had wandered into a junkyard, its sleek modernity a stark, menacing contrast to the surrounding squalor. The engine cut out, and the ensuing silence was more terrifying than the sound had been. Peeking through a narrow crack in the wagon's rotting wall, Ilara watched, her heart hammering a deafening rhythm against her ribs. The driver's door opened with a quiet, solid thud that spoke of wealth and precision engineering. A man emerged. He was old, maybe 80, but he stood straight and tall. He was impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored wool coat, a stark figure of authority against the backdrop of weeds and mud. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, leaning on a silver-handled cane that sank slightly into the soft ground with each step. He didn't look like a thug. He looked like something far more dangerous. He looked like power. The old man began to move toward the wagon. He surveyed the wretched plot with an expression of faint, aristocratic disgust, his gaze sweeping over the rusted oil drum and broken bottles before finally, inevitably, locking onto the derelict wagon. A profound, instinctual dread washed over Ilara, cold and suffocating. This was no lost tourist. This was not a coincidence. She could feel it in her bones. A primal certainty that this man was the ghost she had summoned from the pages of the ledger. As he drew closer, she could make out the details of his face. It was a roadmap of distinguished wrinkles, dominated by a pair of cold, piercingly intelligent eyes that seemed to see and evaluate everything at once. He exuded an aura of absolute control, of a man long accustomed to getting his way. The damp air carried a faint, alien scent toward her, the expensive smell of sandalwood and something sharp like gin, a jarring olfactory intrusion into her world of mold and fear. He stopped about 10 feet from the wagon door, planting his cane firmly in the ground at the edge of the mud. He didn't call out or announce himself. He simply stood there, waiting, a predator so confident in its dominance that it feels no need to rush. The silence stretched, becoming taut and unbearable, thick with unspoken threat. Ilara knew she couldn't hide forever. The man's stillness was a command. Taking a deep, shuddering breath to steady herself, she pushed the groaning, protesting door open and stepped out into the grey afternoon light. She instinctively positioned herself in front of the doorway, a flimsy human shield for her children, who were huddled just inside. She forced herself to lift her chin and meet his gaze. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, as cold and empty as a winter sky. A small, thin-lipped smile touched his mouth, a chilling expression devoid of any warmth or humor. "Good afternoon," he said. His voice was a smooth, cultured baritone, like gravel being poured over velvet. "My name is Alistair Finch," he announced, and the name hit Ilara like a physical blow. Finch. F. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "I am something of a local benefactor. I happened to notice on the county records that this charming piece of history was recently purchased." He made a vague, dismissive gesture toward the rotting hulk of the wagon with a slender, manicured hand. The sarcasm in his voice was a razor blade hidden in the soft folds of his words. "Frankly, I was surprised. This lot has been a festering eyesore for 50 years. I've been attempting to acquire it for some time now, for a civic beautification project." A wave of dizziness swept over Ilara, and the muddy ground felt as if it were swaying beneath her feet. The air grew thin, hard to draw into her lungs. It was him, the ambitious city lawyer from the Ledger. After half a century, he was standing right in front of her. The ghost had a name and a face. She fought to keep her voice from trembling, to mask the sheer, paralyzing terror that was threatening to choke her. We needed a place to live," she managed to stammer, the words sounding feeble and pathetic even to her own ears. Finch's chilling smile widened by a fraction, revealing teeth that were a little too white, a little too perfect for a man his age. Of course. A desperate situation, I imagine." His cold gaze flickered over her worn clothes, her dirty, raw hands, and then lingered for a heartbeat on the wagon itself. For just a second, she saw it. A flash of naked, rapacious hunger in his eyes before the mask of polite society slid back into place. "But this is no place for a woman and her children. It is unsanitary. It is unsafe. Allow me to help you." The word, help, was the ugliest sound she had ever heard. It was not an offer. It was an ultimatum. The air grew thick with his unspoken knowledge. He wasn't guessing. He knew. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a slim leather checkbook and a gleaming gold fountain pen. The sharp click as he uncapped it echoed in the unnerving quiet. "I am prepared, out of the goodness of my heart, to offer you $500 for this land and the vehicle. A tidy profit on your investment, I should think. It would be enough for you to buy a bus ticket to a more suitable city, enough for a fresh start. $500. The offer was a calculated insult, a clear signal that he saw her as nothing more than ignorant, desperate trash. He was testing her. He was dangling a pittance in front of her, expecting her to snatch it up, to prove she had no idea of the real treasure that lay just a few feet away. The number wasn't a negotiation. It was a probe, designed to gauge her ignorance. A sick feeling churned in her stomach, a cocktail of pure fear and a surprising hot spike of fury. Ilara's mind raced, a frantic scramble of calculations and consequences. If she took his money, he would get the wagon, the fortune, and she and her children would walk away with almost nothing, forever looking over their shoulders, wondering when his paranoia would catch up to them. If she refused, she would be confirming his deepest fear, that she knew, that she had found it. She was caught in the jaws of his trap, but then she thought of her children, of the life this money could give them, a life of safety and warmth that this man was trying to steal. A fierce, protective anger surged through her, momentarily burning away the fog of fear. He was trying to bully her, to rob her family of their one impossible chance. She straightened her back, her posture shifting from that of a victim to that of a defender. She lifted her chin. "Thank you for the generous offer, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice impossibly cold and steady. "But it's not for sale." A heavy, dangerous silence descended. The thin, condescending smile vanished from Alistair Finch's face as if it had been wiped away. His pale eyes narrowed, the cool blue hardening into chips of glacial ice. The carefully constructed mask of the benevolent philanthropist disintegrated, revealing the raw, undisguised predator that had been lurking beneath all along. He took one slow, deliberate step closer, and the soft mud squelched audibly under the sole of his polished leather shoe. The air crackled with a sudden, palpable menace. "I don't think you understand me, madam," he said, his voice dropping, the velvet coating gone, leaving only the raw, grating sound of gravel. "Now, this is not a negotiation. That was a charitable offer to remove you and this blight from my community. It would be profoundly unwise to refuse it." He punctuated the sentence by tapping the tip of his silver cane on the ground, a sharp, rhythmic thud that echoed the frantic pounding in Ilara's chest. He let his cold gaze drift from her face to the frightened eyes of Leo, who was peeking out from behind her legs. Then his eyes traveled slowly up the length of the decrepit wagon, lingering on the splintered, dry wood and the peeling paint. "It's a very isolated place out here," he murmured, his voice now a low, dangerous purr that was more terrifying than any shout. "Terrible things can happen in a place like this. No neighbors to speak of, no one to hear you if you scream." He looked directly back at her, a glint of cruel anticipation in his eyes. "Old, dry wood like this," he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "It's a tinderbox. Accidents happen all the time. Fires, for instance. It would be a terrible, terrible tragedy if something were to happen to such a vulnerable family." The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare, as ugly and rotten as the wagon itself. He was telling her he would burn them alive. He would kill her and her children for what was hidden beneath their feet. Finch held her gaze for one more long, terrifying second, letting the full weight of his promise settle into the marrow of her bones. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if sealing a dark pact between them. Then, without another word, he turned his back on her. His movements were once again smooth and unhurried as he walked back to his gleaming car. The expensive door closed with a soft, final thud, sealing him in his world of power and her in her world of terror. The engine purred back to life, and the black car reversed slowly, disappearing back down the muddy track, leaving behind only the faint smell of its exhaust and a silence that was now filled with a chilling, absolute certainty. Ilara stood frozen, her body finally succumbing to a violent tremor she couldn't control. She was no longer just a widow fighting poverty. She was the guardian of a bloody fortune and the target of a ruthless killer. What would you do in her place? Would you run, taking what money you could carry and hoping he never finds you? Or would you stay and fight for the justice this secret demands, knowing you are risking the lives of your children? As the sound of the luxury sedan's engine faded into the oppressive quiet, Clara felt as though the ground had been cut from under her feet. Finch's words hung in the cold and damp air like a toxic mist, a promise of violence that was as real and solid as the rotting wood of the wagon she now leaned against for support. Her knees felt weak, watery, and a violent tremor began in her hands, spreading through her arms until her whole body was shaking. The ledger, wrapped in its cheap plastic bag, felt like a slab of ice against her ribs. He knew. The thought was a relentless, hammering drumbeat in her mind. He didn't just suspect, he knew, and he had just told her, in the calmest, most civilized voice, that he would burn her and her children alive to get what was his. The dry wood beneath her fingertips, once a symbol of decay and poverty, now felt like the kindling of her own funeral pyre. The isolation of this forgotten plot of land had transformed from a misfortune into the architecture of a perfect crime. He had chosen his words with the precision of a surgeon and the malice of a demon. The silence that followed was a living entity, thick and watchful. Every natural sound was now amplified, twisted into a harbinger of doom. The rustle of wind through the tall, dead weeds was the whisper of an approaching footstep. The distant caw of a crow was a cry of warning. The rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water inside the wagon was a clock ticking down to her family's extinction. Ilara's throat constricted, and the air she drew in felt thin and useless, failing to calm the frantic, panicked fluttering in her chest. She stumbled back inside the wagon, her eyes darting wildly around the dim, squalid space. It was no longer a potential home, it was a cage, a flammable trap from which there was no escape. She pulled her children close, burying her face in Mia's hair, inhaling the sweet, innocent scent of her daughter, a smell that was so profoundly out of place in this tomb of rot and fear. A single, cold thought solidified from the chaos in her mind. We are going to die here. The sheer, absolute certainty of it was a physical blow, stealing her breath. She fought against the wave of paralysis, a mother's fierce primal instinct rising to battle the terror. She had to think. She couldn't just wait here for him to send his men, for the smell of gasoline to become a reality. Her mind raced, a frantic slideshow of impossible scenarios. Could they run? Where would they go? They had no money, no transport, no one to turn to. Walking back to town would expose them on the open road. Hiding in the woods felt like a childish fantasy. They would be hunted, found. She was a seamstress, not a survivalist. The money, the stacks of cash still hidden beneath the floorboards, was a useless, toxic weight. To take it would be to carry the evidence of her own supposed crime. To leave it would be to surrender to Finch, a man who had already proven he did not leave loose ends. A hysterical, silent laugh bubbled in her chest. She had found a fortune only to discover it was a death sentence. Every possible path led to a dead end, a checkmate devised 50 years ago by two greedy, ruthless men. The world had shrunk to the four rotting walls of the wagon. Her senses were on fire. Straining against the encroaching twilight, she listened, her entire body a receptor for sound. For any sign of the returning threat, she could almost smell the smoke, feel the heat, hear the screams. She clutched the ledger to her chest, its hard corners digging into her skin. This was the source of it all, this book of secrets. Her one and only weapon was a confession written by a ghost, implicating a man so powerful he could threaten murder as casually as discussing the weather. The weight of her responsibility felt immense, crushing. It wasn't just about her family's survival anymore. It was about the man named Jay, who had been pushed to his death. It was about the partners who were cheated and scared into silence. It was about a 50-year-old crime that had festered in secret, poisoning everything it touched, a poison that was now seeping into her own life, threatening to consume her. As the last sliver of the sun vanished below the horizon, plunging the world into a deep, disorienting indigo, a new light appeared. It was small and faint, a single, unsteady yellow square flickering to life in the distance, through a dense patch of trees she hadn't paid much attention to before. Her heart leaped into her throat. Was it them? Were they already back? But this light wasn't the powerful, sweeping beam of headlights. It was a soft, contained glow, like a lamp in a window. She squinted, her eyes straining in the gloom. It was coming from a small, dilapidated trailer, so half-hidden by overgrown bushes and trees that it seemed to be part of the landscape. She had been here for days and had never noticed it. She was not, it seemed, completely alone, but the discovery brought no comfort, only a fresh spike of adrenaline and a new, terrible question. Was this other resident a witness or a watchman? Ilara's breath hitched as a figure emerged from the trailer, silhouetted against its weak interior light. It was a man, old and stooped, moving with a slow, stiff gait. He began walking not toward the road, but directly toward her wagon. A fresh wave of panic washed over her. This must be one of Finch's men. An observer left to make sure she didn't run. She scrambled back, pulling Leo and Mia deeper into the wagon's shadows, her hand instinctively reaching for a heavy, rusted piece of pipe lying on the floor. Her knuckles were white, her body coiled like a spring, ready to fight. The man continued his slow, deliberate approach, a dark, shuffling shape against the dying light. He wasn't trying to be stealthy. The sound of his worn boots crunching on the gravel and squelching in the soft mud was clear and steady. He stopped just at the edge of the soupy mud surrounding the wagon, a respectful distance away, and for a long moment he just stood there, looking. "That's her," a voice rasped out of the darkness. It was a low, gravelly sound, full of age and phlegm, yet it carried clearly in the still air. "Haven't seen old Karina's pride in nigh on 50 years. Thought she'd rotted to dust by now." Ilara froze, the rusted pipe heavy in her hand. Karina's pride. He had a name for the wagon, a name from the past. This wasn't one of Finch's men, this was someone else. This was a piece of the story she didn't know. Her terror shifted, making way for a sharp, desperate curiosity. Slowly, she lowered the pipe, her muscles trembling with the release of tension. The man took another shuffling step forward, his face now barely visible in the gloom. It was a face carved with deep lines, a map of a long and difficult life. His eyes, though surrounded by wrinkles, seemed sharp and aware. "You must be the new owner," he said. It wasn't a question. "Saw the fancy car earlier. Figured he'd show up sooner or later. He's a patient man, is Mr. Finch, but his patience has its limits." The sound of Finch's name from this stranger's lips sent a jolt through Ilara, a shock of recognition that connected them instantly. He knew. This old man knew. She slowly stepped out of the wagon, her fear replaced by a fragile, tentative flicker of hope. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The old man's gaze was fixed on the wagon, a strange, distant look in his eyes, as if he were seeing ghosts in the peeling paint. "Name's Silas," he said, finally turning his sharp gaze on her. "I live over in that trailer. Lived there a long, long time." He gestured with his chin toward the derelict wagon. "I was just a boy, a roustabout, when the Magnifico Mondo circus rolled through this county for the last time. I used to polish the brass trim on this very wagon. It was the ringmaster's private quarters. He called it Carina's Pride, after his wife who'd passed." He spoke the words with a grim finality, the memories as solid as the mud under his feet. Ilara stared at him, her mind struggling to absorb the impossible coincidence. A witness, a living witness, had been parked next door her entire time here. "He was here," she said, the words spilling out in a rush. "Finch. He offered me money. He threatened us." Silas nodded slowly, his expression grim but unsurprised. "Sounds like him. All velvet words and iron fists." He looked past her, at the small, frightened faces of her children peeking out from the darkness of the wagon. His expression softened for a moment. "That's no place to be tonight, Mom. Not now he's shown his hand. Come on. Come inside my place. It ain't much, but it's dry, and the walls are metal, not kindling." The offer was a lifeline thrown into a raging sea. Without a second thought, Ilara gathered her children, their small hands cold in hers, and followed the old man across the dark, muddy lot, the plastic-wrapped ledger a cold, hard secret still pressed against her body. Silas's trailer was cramped and smelled intensely of stale pipe tobacco, old coffee, and damp wool, but it was warm. Her single propane lamp cast a steady golden glow over a space crowded with a lifetime's worth of accumulated objects. Stacks of yellowing paperback books, chipped coffee mugs, and strange, hand-carved wooden birds. It was the clutter of a life lived, not the emptiness of decay. The feeling of safety was so abrupt and overwhelming that Ilara felt her knees weaken with relief. Silas ignored their muddy shoes, gesturing them toward a small, threadbare sofa. He moved with a slow, methodical economy, pouring hot water from a kettle on a small gas stove into 2 mugs with tea bags already in them. He handed one to Ilara. The warmth of the cheap ceramic against her frozen fingers was a profound comfort. He finally found it. "Then," Silas said quietly, settling into a worn armchair that groaned under his weight, "after all these years, knew he was still looking. How do you know him? How do you know about the wagon?" Ilara asked, her voice trembling as she wrapped her hands around the mug. Her children were huddled together at the far end of the sofa, staring with wide, silent eyes at the strange new surroundings. Silas took a long sip of his tea before answering, his gaze distant. "Oh, I know Finch. I was there, see? A teenager. Just a dumb kid hired to haul rope and stake tents. But I had eyes. I saw that city lawyer. All slicked back hair and shiny shoes, meeting with the ringmaster in secret, always talking in whispers. I saw the way the ringmaster got after that. Jumpy, paranoid. Started reinforcing the floor of his wagon himself, late at night when he thought no one was watching." He tapped his temple with a crooked finger. "I didn't know what it was about then, but I never forgot that lawyer's face, like a smiling wolf." A cold certainty settled in Ilara's gut. She reached into her coat and pulled out the plastic-wrapped bundle. The crinkle of the bag was loud in the small trailer. She laid the ledger and the yellowed newspaper clippings on the small, cluttered table between them. "I found this," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "under the floor." Silas leaned forward, his sharp eyes fixated on the leather-bound book. He didn't look surprised, only grimly resigned, as if he were seeing an old ghost he had long expected to return. He reached out with a gnarled, trembling hand and touched the cover of the ledger, a gesture of both reverence and revulsion. "So that's where he kept it," he murmured. "The whole damn story." He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw the full depth of the pain he carried in his eyes, a sorrow that had been simmering for half a century. "That robbery wasn't clean," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The papers said it was," Ilara countered softly, remembering the articles. "They said the thieves were like ghosts." Silas let out a short, harsh, bitter laugh. "The papers said what the police told them. But there was a teller on duty that morning, a young man. He must have hit a silent alarm or something. One of the circus crew, one of the acrobats, panicked. They shot him, killed him right there behind the counter. The ringmaster paid off the right people to keep it quiet, to make it seem like a perfect crime. It was better for the legend, see? Better for hiding. A clean heist doesn't have a murder investigation breathing down its neck." The air in the small trailer grew heavy, thick with the weight of the old crime. Ilara felt a profound chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The money wasn't just blood money in a metaphorical sense. It was tied to a real, forgotten victim. "That's the part Finch doesn't know," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, raw with a grief that 50 years had not managed to dull. "He just knows about the theft. He doesn't know why I stayed here, why I've been watching this lot for 5 decades. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers, the ancient pain now a burning, terrible fire. "They never released the teller's name to the public. Wanted to protect the family from the presser, they said." He paused, and his next words were a hammer blow to Ilara's soul. "His name was Thomas Miller. He was my older brother." The confession hung in the air, devastating in its simplicity. The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place, not with a click, but with the shattering of a heart. This wasn't about a stranger's crime for Silas. It was the defining tragedy of his life. He was not just a witness. He was the guardian of his brother's memory, waiting for a justice he had probably long given up on. Ilara stared at him, speechless. The entire story had been reshaped, recast in a new, more terrible light. This wasn't a thriller about stolen money. It was a tragedy about a murdered boy and the brother who never stopped waiting. Her own fear suddenly seemed selfish, small in the face of his half-century vigil. She looked at the ledger, at the instrument of Finch's greed and the ringmaster's betrayal, and she saw it now as the only key to unlocking this immense, silent sorrow. Her resolve, which had been wavering, hardened into something unbreakable. This was no longer about escaping with a fortune. It was about exposing a killer and his accomplice. It was about giving this old, broken man the justice he had spent his entire life waiting for. She had stumbled into this story by accident, but she now felt a profound, unshakable duty to see it through to the end. "The ringmaster was a clever, paranoid bastard," Silas said, his voice regaining a bit of its rough edge, pulling her from her thoughts. "He trusted no one, not Finch, not his crew. He always had a way out. I saw him working on it myself, when I was bringing him his dinner one night." He gestured vaguely toward the dark shape of the wagon, visible through his small window. "Out back." He made a bolt hole. The back wall of the sleeping area, one of the panels, is rotted through. Behind it, the fence is low, covered in briar bushes, so no one would look close. It leads straight into the deep woods. It's an escape route. He'd be gone in 30 seconds, and anyone watching the front would never see a thing. The information was a sudden, brilliant flash of light in the darkness, a way out. Not just a fantasy of running, but a real, tangible path to safety. "We have to call the police," Ilara said, her voice urgent. Silas shook his head, a grim certainty on his face. "Not the local boys. Finch owns this town. He owns the sheriff. He's been the big benefactor here for decades, putting his name on libraries and hospital wings. He's got his hooks in everything. Calling them would be like calling Finch himself to tell him we have the evidence." The statement confirmed Ilara's worst fears. They were completely isolated, surrounded by the enemy's influence. The law, the one thing she should have been able to turn to, was just another one of Finch's possessions. The sense of being trapped returned, more potent than ever. They had the evidence, but they were stranded on an island, and the tide of Finch's power was rising around them, threatening to drown them before they could ever reach the shore. "I have a friend," Silas said after a long pause, his eyes glinting in the lamplight. "A good man, a retired state detective, lives 2 counties over. He's the one who told me they hushed up my brother's murder. He never liked the smell of it. I've got an old ham radio. I can reach him, but not tonight. Too risky. Finch might have people listening. We wait for morning. At first light, I'll make the call." He looked at her, his gaze steady and serious. "But he will come back tonight, girl. Finch. He's not a man who waits. He gave you his warning. You spat in his eye. He'll send his dogs to collect what he thinks is his. We need to be ready to run." The plan was thin, fragile, a desperate gamble on a single radio call, but it was more than she'd had an hour ago. It was a plan, it was a chance. The hours that followed were the longest of Ilara's life. The three of them sat in the small, warm trailer while the night grew deeper and more menacing outside. Leo and Mia, exhausted by the fear and the upheaval, finally drifted into a fitful sleep on the lumpy sofa, curled together like two small animals seeking warmth. Ilara and Silas sat in a tense, watchful silence, the propane lamp casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The only sounds were the soft hissing of the lamp and the occasional mournful hoot of an owl from the deep woods. Every creak of the old trailer, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Ilara's system. She held the cold, empty tea mug in her hands, her knuckles white. She was listening, waiting for the sound that she knew, with absolute certainty, was coming. The sound of an engine. It came just after midnight. It wasn't the confident purr of Finch's sedan. It was something rougher, meaner, the low, sputtering rumble of an old truck, its engine poorly tuned. The vehicle came to a stop not by the road, but drove right onto the muddy lot, its headlights cutting two stark-eye white cones through the darkness, pinning the derelict wagon in their glare. Silas immediately extinguished the propane lamp, plunging the trailer into near-total darkness. "Get the kids," he whispered, his voice a low, urgent command. "Get the bag. Be ready to go." The truck doors opened and closed with loud, metallic slams that echoed across the silent property. Heavy footsteps, two pairs, at least, crunched on the gravel, then squelched through the mud. Low, rough voices exchanged a few words, too indistinct to make out, but their tone was brutal and impatient. Ilara's heart was a wild, frantic drum against her ribs. She moved on pure instinct, shaking Leo awake, scooping the sleeping Mia into her arms. The little girl stirred, murmuring a protest, and Ilara pressed a finger to her lips, her eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea for quiet. Leo, seeing the stark terror on his mother's face and the harsh headlights outside, needed no explanation. He was instantly awake, his young face pale but his eyes clear. He grabbed the small backpack that contained the ledger, the clippings, and one precious bundle of the stolen cash he had decided to take, slinging it over his shoulder. They were a silent, terrified unit, poised for flight, their breathing shallow and loud in the suffocating quiet of the trailer. Ilara could smell the mud and the night air, and beneath it, something else. A faint, sharp, chemical odor that made her stomach clench with a new, specific terror. Then came the sound, a liquid, sloshing sound, followed by the glugging of a container being emptied. It was a sound that would be forever seared into Ilara's memory. The sharp, sickeningly sweet smell of gasoline suddenly flooded the air, so potent it was almost gag-inducing. They were dousing the wagon. The threat was no longer an abstract concept. It was happening right now. The dry 50-year-old wood was drinking in the accelerant, turning from a derelict home into a perfectly prepared bomb. Ilara clutched Mia tighter, the child's warm, solid weight a stark contrast to the cold, liquid dread pouring into her veins. She could hear the men's boots moving around the wagon, methodical, efficient. They were painting her tomb with gasoline, and she and her children had been just moments away from being inside. "All right, lady," a rough voice bellowed, the sound shockingly loud, shattering the night. "Mr. Finch is done being polite. You got 1 minute? 1 minute to throw out the bag you found? You do that and we'll let you and the kids walk away. You don't, and we light this thing up with you inside it." The ultimatum was a raw, brutal shout, echoing with a chilling certainty that they believed she was still in there. They hadn't seen her leave. They were about to commit murder, convinced their victims were cowering just a few feet away from them. The casual cruelty of it, the utter disregard for the lives of her children, sent a shard of ice through Ilara's heart. There was no negotiation to be had here. There was no reasoning. There was only the cold, hard math of their own survival. "Now," Silas whispered from the darkness near the trailer door, Go now. Through the backs into the woods. Don't stop running." Ilara didn't hesitate. Holding Mia tight against her chest with one arm and grabbing Leo's hand with the other, she followed Silas as he quietly unlatched the trailer's flimsy back door. It opened onto the darkest part of the lot, away from the truck's headlights. The cold night air was a shock, thick with the fumes of gasoline. They slipped out into the shadows, moving low and fast. Her feet sank into the cold mud, the sound seeming deafeningly loud to her own ears. They were completely exposed. If one of the men turned at the wrong moment, they would be seen. Every nerve in her body screamed with the effort of remaining silent, of moving her precious, terrified children through the darkness without a single cry or stumble. They reached the back of the wagon. The smell of gasoline was overpowering here, and she could see the dark, wet sheen of it coating the wood. Just beyond it was the fence line Silas had described, a tangled mass of briars and shadows. They pushed through the rotted back panel of the wagon, which gave way with a soft, crumbling sound. This was the ringmaster's bolt hole. As Ilara scrambled through the low gap in the barbed wire fence, snagging her coat, she risked a single glance back. She saw one of the silhouettes, a large, dark shape, raise his arm. She saw the tiny, brief flare of a lighter, a small, innocent-looking flame against the immense darkness. He tossed it. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a sound that was not an explosion but a deep, hungry whoomp, the world erupted in light. The wagon was instantly engulfed in a roaring ball of orange and red flame. The heat was a physical blow, a wave of scorching air that pushed against them even from 50 feet away. The fire climbed the dry wood with a terrifying speed, consuming the structure in seconds, turning the symbol of Ilara's desperation and hope into a raging inferno against the black canvas of the night sky. The two thugs, startled by the sheer ferocity of the blaze, took a few steps back. From the deep shadows of the woods, hidden and safe in the entrance to Silas's trailer, Ilara, her children, and the old man watched it burn. The fire illuminated their faces, the children's, pale with shock and terror, Silas's, a grim mask of ancient sorrow and newfound resolve, and Ilara's, streaked with tears and soot, but her eyes, reflecting the flames, were no longer filled with fear. They were filled with the hard, bright, burning light of the fire itself, the fire of retribution. The inferno roared, a monstrous, living beast devouring 50 years of secrets in a single, voracious gulp. From the relative safety of Silas's trailer doorway, Ilara felt the searing heat on her face, a brutal contrast to the cold terror that had just encased her heart. She held her children tight, their small bodies trembling not from cold but from the awesome, terrifying spectacle of the fire. The wagon, her last, failed hope, was being violently purified, its rot and decay consumed by cleansing flames that painted the night sky in hellish hues of orange and gold. The acrid smell of burning wood, ancient dust and gasoline filled her lungs, a scent she would never forget. Silas moved past them, a dark, determined shadow against the blaze. He ignored the fire, his focus singular. He knelt before a large, battered metal case, its latches clicking open with a sound of finality. Inside was the ham radio, a relic from another era that now held the key to their future. As the fire raged, he began to turn the dials, a faint crackle of static joining the roar of the flames, a tiny voice of order preparing to speak into the chaos. The static hissed and popped, a frantic, disembodied sound fighting against the crackle of the dying fire. Silas, his face illuminated by the radio's green glow, held the microphone close to his mouth. "Albatross, this is Sparrow. Do you copy?" "Albatross," he rasped, his voice low and urgent. The silence stretched, thick and agonizing. Ilara held her breath, clutching the backpack containing the ledger, its weight a dense anchor in a world that had dissolved into flame and shadow. Then a voice, faint and distorted by distance, crackled back through the speaker. "Sparrow, I copy. It's been a long time. What's your traffic?" Silas leaned closer, his knuckles white on the microphone. "The package is open." The lawyer made a move. "It's about Tommen," he said, the name hanging in the air, heavy with 5 decades of grief. "The fire is burning now. We need the cavalry. Albatross, the real cavalry, not the local chapter." There was a pause. Then the voice came back clear and firm. Understood. Sit tight, Sparrow. Help is on the way. ETA is sunrise. As the first weak fingers of dawn painted the smoke-filled sky in shades of bruised purple and grey, they arrived. Not with sirens, but with the quiet, confident hum of dark-coloured sedans navigating the muddy lane. Men in crisp, dark suits and jackets with FBI, emblazoned in stark yellow letters, emerged, their movements calm, professional, and radiating an aura of absolute authority that Finch could not touch. They moved with purpose, securing the smouldering, blackened remains of the wagon, their voices low and serious. An agent, a woman with kind but weary eyes, approached Ilara, who stood with her children beside Silas's trailer. "Ma'am, I'm Special Agent Davies," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We understand you have something for us." Ilara felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. She nodded, unable to speak, the crushing weight on her chest finally beginning to lift. The law was here, not Finch's law, real law. The nightmare was finally starting to recede, replaced by the cold, clear light of morning. Seated in the back of a warm government vehicle, a thick wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, Ilara finally let go of the secret. The agent, Davies, sat opposite her, a small digital recorder on the seat between them. With trembling hands, Ilara unzipped the backpack and handed over the leather-bound ledger, the brittle newspaper clippings, and the single, grimy bundle of cash. "It's all in there," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "And what he did, what Finch helped him do." As she spoke, the story poured out of her, the desperation, the discovery, the confrontation, the fire. Davies listened without interruption, her gaze never leaving Ilara's face. The simple act of being heard, of being believed, was a balm on her shattered nerves. The words, which had been a toxic, terrifying secret, were now evidence. They were no longer her burden to carry alone. She watched as the agent placed the ledger into a clear evidence bag, sealing away 50 years of crime and grief, its power now transferred to the hands of justice. The raid on Alistair Finch's sprawling estate was swift and silent. Federal agents swarmed the manicured grounds, bypassing his expensive security system with contemptuous ease. They found him in his library, a cavernous room lined with leather-bound books that served as a testament to a life built on a lie. He was dressed in a silk dressing gown, a glass of expensive brandy in his hand, a look of irritated surprise on his face that quickly curdled into disbelief, and then pure, unadulterated fury as he saw the letters on their jackets. His threats, the ones that had terrified Ilara, were useless here. His name, which opened every door in Harmony Creek, meant nothing to these men. They were not his local sheriff, bought and paid for. They were the consequence he had outrun for 50 years, arriving at last. The mask of the benevolent philanthropist shattered, revealing the cornered, snarling predator beneath. His world of power and influence was being dismantled around him, board by board, lie by lie, by a force he could not bribe or intimidate. The image was broadcast on the national news that evening. Alistair Finch, the celebrated benefactor and real estate tycoon, being led from his mansion in handcuffs. His face was a mask of cold rage, his impeccably tailored suit rumpled. As he was pushed toward a waiting car, his silver-handled cane, the very one he had used to intimidate Ilara, was knocked from his grasp, clattering uselessly onto the pristine gravel of his own driveway. The sound was a small, perfect punctuation mark on the end of his reign. The story of the Magnifico Mondo circus heist, of the hidden fortune and the covered-up murder of a young bank teller named Thomas Miller, was finally being told to the world, not as a romantic legend, but as a sordid tale of greed and homicide. Finch's carefully constructed legacy, built over a lifetime with stolen money and secrets, crumbled to dust in a matter of hours, his name forever redefined from philanthropist to murderer's accomplice. The truth, unearthed by a desperate mother, had finally caught up to him. Weeks later, in a sterile government office that smelled of clean carpets and bureaucracy, a federal prosecutor explained the final resolution. Ilara sat beside Silas, a pro bono lawyer at her other side. "Mr. Finch and his associates are facing a raft of federal charges, including conspiracy and complicity in the murder of Thomas Miller," the prosecutor said, his tone formal. The ledger was the key. He then turned to the money. The statute of limitations on the bank theft itself expired decades ago. The bank is defunct, and its assets were absorbed by a dozen other corporations. Frankly, it would be impossible to determine the legal ownership of these funds. He paused, looking directly at Ilara. Given your essential role in closing a 50-year-old homicide case and the extreme duress you were placed under, the Department of Justice has signed off. A substantial portion of the recovered assets, after settling various administrative claims, is being released to you as a legal finder's fee. It's yours, Ms. Ilara, free and clear. The first thing she bought was not a mansion, but a meal. In a clean, brightly lit family restaurant far from Harmony Creek, Ilara, Leo, Mia, and Silas sat at a sturdy wooden table. The air smelled of roasting chicken and freshly baked bread. Mia, her face beaming, colored on a paper placemat with a brand new set of crayons. Leo, a plate piled high with food in front of him, was laughing, a real, carefree laugh that Ilara hadn't heard in over a year. She watched them, a profound, aching love filling her chest. She looked at Silas, who was slowly eating a bowl of hot soup, a look of quiet peace on his old, wrinkled face. He had finally brought justice for his brother. She picked up her fork, its weight solid and real in her hand. There were no more foreclosure notices, no more counting pennies, no more gnawing hunger. The terror was gone, replaced by the simple, miraculous clatter of silverware on a plate and the sound of her children's happiness. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. 6 months later, the hum of a sewing machine once again filled Ilara's life. But this was a new sound, in a new place. It came from a brand new machine, perched in a sun-drenched sewing room in a modest but beautiful house that was all hers. Sunlight streamed through a large window, overlooking a green backyard where Mia was playing on a swing set. In the living room, Leo was at a real desk, a new computer open as he worked on a school project. The house smelled not of mold and decay, but of fresh paint and the scent of the lemon cake she was baking. Silas sat in a comfortable armchair by the fire, reading a book, a permanent resident in the guest suite they had insisted he take. He was family now. Ilara paused her sewing, placing a hand on the smooth, humming machine. Her hands, once symbols of her failure, were now tools of creation and joy once more. She was not just surviving. She was building. She was home. That evening, the table was laden with food. A perfectly roasted chicken sat in the center, surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes, green beans, and a basket of warm bread. Ilara watched her children and Silas eat, their faces glowing in the warm light of the dining room. Her heart felt full, a feeling she had once thought was lost to her forever. She had descended into the deepest, darkest pit of despair, only to find a hidden path leading back to the light, paved with a 50-year-old secret and her own refusal to surrender. Her journey from the edge of homelessness to a life of safety and peace was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Ilara's story is a powerful reminder that even in the most desperate of circumstances, courage can rewrite our destiny. If you were moved by her incredible journey and want to discover more stories of survival and justice, make sure to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.